Okay. I did see we got, we have 4 with us already. Good morning, everyone. If you're joining us in the morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're coming from. We are just going to wait maybe another minute for people to join, and then we'll begin. Okay. All right, wonderful. I see. Hello to those joining us. We're happy to have you here with us. Okay. I'll just wait another few seconds and we'll begin. Usually it takes a minute for people to join, but this is great. Very timely. All right, I think I'll start now. So, hi everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the latest in Sen Talk series of speaking events. These are called Sen Explained, and we are in partnership with professionals and lay people and everyone in between to discuss special educational needs and attempt to move the conversation forward. If you aren't familiar with our work at Sen Talk, we are a nonprofit organization based in South London with a mission to improve social and emotional outcomes and promote inclusion for children and young people with additional needs and their families. Today, we are delighted to have Nicola Reekie with us to present about parenting a young person with PDA and approaches to create a healthier perspective on demands. So following her talk, which will last around 30 to 40 minutes, there'll be a Q&A session for the remainder of the hour. So please feel free to ask any questions at any time during the webinar by typing in the chat box to the right of your screen. And a recording will be made available to watch on demand on YouTube immediately after this session, so you'll have access as you need. So I would now like to introduce Nicola Reekie. Nicola is a qualified hypnotherapist, neuro-linguistic therapist, Theta Healer and Reiki practitioner. She is also a mother to 2 boys, one of whom has pathological demand avoidance, a PDA diagnosis, which is a profile on the autism spectrum, and the other is awaiting an autism diagnosis. So as a result of her lived experiences, Nicola founded the PDA Sanctuary, the PDA Space, and the PDA Summit. Incredible spaces and projects with an aim to raise awareness, share strategies and guidance, and increase access to support for PDA individuals and their families. So with that said, I will turn it over to Nicola for her presentation. So I'm going to pull up our slides here, and you'll have to let me know when you can see them. All right.
So thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity today. And the first slide is going to look at what is PDA. See if you can switch it across. Fantastic. So what is PDA? Well, Pathological Demand Avoidance was coined PDA back in the 80s by Elizabeth Newsom and is acknowledged as a profile of autism. The National Autistic Society updated their website to include PDA as a profile in 2015. So I'm just going to, for a moment, run through a few of the characteristics of what PDA is, then share a small part of our journey before I go and explain in more depth about what a demand is and the different types of demands, some of which you may not have considered a demand. So very often a person with PDA will resist everyday ordinary demands of life. And these could be asked or unsaid or just expected. They may also give demands when their anxiety is very high. We'll use social strategies as part of the avoidance, giving examples And that may be that, and I'm going to share more as we go through. You know, my son would use excuses like my arms don't work or my legs have stopped working. They often will appear sociable, but lack the understanding underpinning that sociability, often with intense mood swings, leading very often to needing to have something there and there. And the Jekyll and Hyde behaviour is often spoken about. And this high anxiety can be likened to a panic attack at any time. And they're often very comfortable in role play, pretense, and a belief style. And again, I will run through this in a little bit more detail as we go through. My experience has been, I learned about PDA 4.5 years ago, and I'll explain a little bit more. But I've really listened to a lot of adult PDAs because it's given me that window of understanding, of really getting to understand my son a little bit more. And a couple of people that I listen or follow is Julia Daunt. Sally Cat writes and puts up a lot of amazing memes. Rico. Kyra's got a brilliant blog. Harry Thompson, just to name a few. So, our time. So, when my son was very small, the only time he ever seemed to be happy was when he was in his buggy. And if I held him, you know, he'd often be upset if he was put to be in his cot. Again, you know, couldn't self-soothe, couldn't be calm, but walking around, being in his buggy, was always giving him that time. He went to nursery, and under 3 years old, they asked me, you know, could I go and get his hearing tested? And they explained that they were noticing that time after time, they were coming to an ending of an activity within the nursery. And they would notice that he'd be sort of in his own land, his own little space. And they assumed it was because he couldn't hear them. Whereas actually, knowing and understanding now more about PDA, it was the ending of a transition, or that he was enjoying the topic or the activity so much, he didn't want it to end. And a lot of these behaviours and struggles that we saw at this time, I put down as either naughty behaviour or just even defiance, which isn't a word I would ever use now. And, you know, it's taken a lot of time and understanding and unpicking behaviour and learning about PDA that's given me the opportunity to understand that all of this behaviour is a way of him needing to communicate his needs to us. So I got put on a parenting course because I shared a lot of the challenges. And then the next slide, it has, you know, that upset and just not being able to cope, you know. And I would notice that when we were out and about, he would cover his ears by loud noises, or he'd really struggle with different sensory needs, and I would never know why. And then because of the struggles we were facing, I got put on a parenting course. And like many parents with children with different needs, the parenting courses don't really fit for our children. Their strategies just seem to cause more and more stress and upset. And I've recently done a Facebook Live in my group and written about how the traditional strategies cause more upset and concern for our PDA young people. And I'm just going to keep checking all my notes so I don't leave anything out. So I would notice for hours he would spend playing with his Playmobil or Lego in real role playing. And it was very, very set and very the similar scenario each time, and it was always around army or the police. So it was a real set way of, and he would have his set routines. And I remember a friend of his coming over and saying to me, you know, I'm really finding he's really controlling if I try to change the way we play, which was really difficult. And I spoke to my son and asked, could you play and include his friend a little bit more? Obviously, I now know that he, when he's anxious, needs to feel that he's in control. And I would have done things very differently and would have modelled the behaviour and sat and played with them rather than leaving them to play on their own. And I often look back to the past of, in a way, him feeling trapped in the corner of a room. And this real, you know, sign of behaviour, I now have so much more understanding of, especially the fight or flight. I mean, there's 4 parts to it, but I'll just cover the fight or flight, you know, and with him not understanding the social norms and not getting his demands met, you know, feeling in the corner and his behaviour really, so being in that fight or flight constantly and not really understanding what's going on. And at the same time as all of this was going on, it was really easy for us as a family to, in a way, put it down to our situation and our scenario. Dad was working. I now live in Wales, so Dad was working in Wales. He had a little brother. And life was really, in a way, quite upside down. And before his dad got the job in Wales, he'd been home for 9 months as he'd been made redundant. So there was a lot of changes and a lot of challenges that had been thrown up. And I think we all know, if we have siblings, you know, that having a new baby means that the time and energy often goes to the baby. So it was really easy to put some of the behaviour and things I was experiencing down to the challenges he was facing. And, you know, as time went on, it became more and more obvious there was something bigger going on. And once, sorry, I'm getting really warm. And so as we moved, we then came to Wales, and often I kept putting it down again. You know, we'd moved 150 miles. We hadn't had a huge amount of time to plan our move and come and show him parts of Wales, just due to, you know, the situation we were under. And our life, I just felt we were constantly walking on eggshells. You know, there were just so many times where it would be, why did we have that meltdown? Why did we, you know, why did that not work? And it would be over even the simplest things. I remember one day, you know, giving him fish fingers that had broken as I'd got them out of the tray, and there'd been a meltdown. And could never understand what was going on. And literally, you know, it would be the amount of time and energy that would be spent trying to navigate and give him a supportive time without any explosions. And at that time, you know, we were faced with a lot of volatility. You know, if that had been him hitting out or verbally struggling. And we, like many parents, accessed various different professionals. And unfortunately, as pathological demand avoidance isn't in the diagnostic manual, especially then, sort of over 5 years ago, it was really not heard of a great deal. And I kept being told, no, he's not autistic. He's just a very, very anxious young boy. Which led me to be really confused, because intuitively I knew he was autistic. And I'd remembered a lot of behaviours, especially when he was younger. However, as the anxiety had grown and there was a lot more volatility and a lot more other behaviour, I would often not necessarily see the autistic tendencies. And so those three magic words, PDA, a scenario had happened, and I was talking with a really good friend and shared an experience with her. And she suggested I looked up PDA. And it's quite interesting that I actually typed the letters into my phone because I was so concerned I would forget these three letters. It feels quite strange to think 4.5 years ago that I would be so concerned. A week later, we went to our local village town to have a lazy lunch, and my son had never actually gone into this cafe. We'd walked past it numerous times, and he stood outside having an absolute meltdown. And it was quite a good, important day for me as a family, due to a family member passing away years before. And I now can understand, he was literally in flight or fright, but he was outside, and anyone would think that we were asking him to do something really, really dangerous. And it was for him, going somewhere new, not knowing the sensory, not understanding the food they would serve. Would he like it? And I know many families share about how going out for meals is just so difficult for their young people. He came and he sat and he ate with us without the waitresses asking, and, really concerned about what had gone on. And we then went on to somewhere else, which also had caused a massive upset, which led me, when we got home, to do some research and put the three letters in to good old Google. And then I found a link to something called the EDQ, the Extreme Demand Questionnaire. And I'll never forget the goosebumps and just shock that I felt. At long last, somebody had written about my son completely and utterly, which is why the light bulb moment is really heavily linked with PDA, because it's like that light bulb moment of, wow. I felt for years I've been walking in the dark, and now the light came on and I could really understand so much of what was going on for him. And I spent a lot of time. I mean, I still spend a lot of time, but especially that first few years, but that first 6 months, doing courses, reading, watching webinars, just as much as I could. There wasn't as many webinars or YouTube 4 years ago as there are now, but I just completely and utterly just read as much as I could around pathological demand avoidance. I was really fortunate. There was a company that don't do trainings now, but I was able to come to London and do one of their one-day trainings, and it just gave me that so much understanding and underpinning of how to support our son. I then went on to do with the PDA Society, the PDA parenting course. And we were really fortunate, due to family support, to be able to get him assessed for PDA and get the PDA diagnosis with help for psychology. And that really was just such a big support, because for years we'd been told, no, he wasn't autistic. And I'm sure there are many parents who will also have been blamed or judged or told, you know, if they did this differently, they needed tighter boundaries, they needed to be stricter, they needed to remove electronics. I'm sure, you know, it will resonate with many people. And then I started on this new path of parenting. And it's been interesting. And I will say that I don't get it right every time, but I have a lot more compassion and gentleness for myself. During this time, I did hit a massive burnout. I'm sure it was from balancing so many different plates, endeavouring to support our sons, you know, without any support locally, because all of our support was back in London. As a holistic therapist, I was going and giving treatments on a regular basis. And then we had some very large bereavements with the family. But I'll come back to the whole burnout and what, in a way, my burnout gave me the opportunity to create the PDA Space. So what are demands? Now, Julia Daunt, me, myself, and PDA.com has kindly let me use one of her memes. And this is just such a useful picture, because what is a demand? Well, we often know that if I told you to grab a notebook and a pen, that's an obvious demand. But have you thought about, you know, rules, timetables, menus, responsibilities, an agenda, the direct demands, the verbal demands, the unseen demands, the unheard demands, the expectations of how you're to behave, if that's celebrations or other times, rotas, orders. I'm just going to have a sip of water. So there's so many demands put out in life. So once I started to understand a little bit more that I needed to reduce demands, and I'd read, you know, you need to create a low demand household. I was a little bit confused. How do you do that? And so I'm a dyslexic person, so writing doesn't come naturally to me. And so I decided I would record myself one morning, which is where what is a demand came from. And I decided I would record myself in the morning to hear what I would ask my son to do. And it was a much longer list than this. But in the gist of it was thinking about get up, get dressed, brush your teeth. Come on, have your breakfast. Your breakfast here. Grab your bag. Here's your shoes. Get your shoes on. Here's your coat. And I listened to it later on in the day and realised how many demands before he'd even got out of the door for school. And I started to understand, I'm quite a visual person, like a bucket full of demands or emotions, and really starting to understand that no wonder when he got home after school he'd explode, because he just had too much. I did a similar thing of recording later in the day as well. And I spent a few days, weeks, and I still do, in the quiet time in the morning, think, how can I reframe this? How can I change asking him? Because at that time, I believed it was really, certain of these items were really important. As time's gone on, I've really started to let go of some of my beliefs and expectations around what's important. And my parenting style has really changed. You know, I was probably never necessarily the authoritarian, but really did believe that as a parent, we know best. And I must admit, I've probably done all four of these, of just sort of completely going back and thinking, well, I don't know. And I found it really difficult of how do I parent my child, my young person. However, I have learned some very small key phrases. And one of the big things has been learning different skills at different times. So when he was smaller, doing races, or who can get dressed first, or who can get their shoes on first. Obviously, you know, letting him be first, but really showing that I wasn't just letting him. Giving a very small amount of choice, because too much choice is again a demand. But perhaps, where are you going to brush your teeth? Upstairs or downstairs? If there was a choice of shoes, having 2 pairs of shoes, or where should we put them on the stairs or on the sofa? And just gently, one of the biggest things I've learned though, is to really give more time to everything, which can be really difficult when there are explosions and there are so much going on, but just adding an extra half an hour into the morning. Just going to have another sip of water. And as he's got older now, he's a teen, I do something called Plan B. And that's where you talk to the young person or to any person and you go through the scenario and the situation. And now he's older, he's learned that actually it's a lot easier. He just gets up and gets dressed straight away. He doesn't get asked. He doesn't need to be reminded, and he gets it done. I'm able to come down and just put his breakfast next to him. So all the things that in the past would have caused an absolute meltdown, I'm just able to literally just put a food or drink near him and ready to make it a more relaxing scenario. And then as far as Plan B, what did we do? Well, pointed out the things that needed to happen and the time. And then supported him to create his own routine in the morning. And quite early in of going to senior school, he missed the school bus. And so we did a Plan B. And if it had happened so much earlier, I may have got really like, wow, if you hadn't been on your phone. But instead, I took it as a real bonus and used it as a time to go through what could we do differently. And he chose that he would put alarms on his phone to remind him. And he put one on 10 minutes before he needed to go. And so that was his way of managing himself and around that demand. I know lots of other families have used all sorts of different things to set alarms, or if it's Siri who does them. Now, the balloons, the birthday celebrations. So the indirect demands. Many of us will enjoy different celebrations, if it's Christmas, birthdays, weddings, whatever it may be. But it is another indirect demand. What does that mean? Well, there's an expectation of how we're to behave. For example, I remember talking to Harry Thompson because he came to talk in Cardiff a couple of weeks before Mothering Sunday, and I asked, and he said, I can't wish my mum a happy Mother's Day. And the word happy can be a massive trigger for the PDA community, because again, there's an expectation of how you are to be. And days out, parents and we can often be like, oh, that didn't go how we expected. Because again, they have the feeling of an expectation of how to be. And this normality, perhaps in the UK more than some other countries, but this saying hello and goodbye and waving goodbye. And again, it's an indirect demand and expectation. And it's a lot more in depth than that as well. Like, you know, it's a transition and all sorts of changes. But for today, just looking at the indirect demand, it is a massive demand to say hello or goodbye. And often they then will appear to be rude when actually they just find it too difficult. Many families, and I know we've noticed that the celebrating his own birthday has got so much easier as he's older, and we understand. And we give him the choice of how he wants the day and what he'd like to do and how to plan it. It can be quite difficult with siblings. When he was younger, he was able to also plan his brother's birthday and, you know, giving him presents. Now we don't have an expectation of him to be in the same room. And in a way, I'm not necessarily one of, you know, this idea of in schools having a car to be able to, you know, excuse themselves, but he knows that he can just leave when he finds it too hard to stay there. So, indirect sensory demands, what does that mean? And indirect sensory demands, you know, we often may not understand why all of a sudden there's all these different types of behaviour going on. And depending on your own neurology or sensitivities, you may be aware of some of these, and some of them you may not be. So thinking of our indirect sensory and that clock, how many times have you been in bed and perhaps there was that clicking clock? Oh, not talk. So thinking about that clicking, a clock ticking away, and how that can be. And that need to perhaps turn it off. Sometimes for our young people or adults, that can be really, really difficult. And there are many, many indirect sensory demands that you may not have considered. And so it's learning to be a detective. Maybe going around your house, your home, perhaps being in a room. You know, if it's a time when perhaps you haven't got your children, is imagine putting like a blindfold on, because when we close our eyes, our other senses become a lot stronger. And it may give you the opportunity to notice some of the noises that you don't normally notice. So the fridge purring, the boiler jumping on, whatever it may be. Because it may give you that indicator of an understanding of why sometimes your child will just explode and you don't know why. Because all of this ticking, humming, lights, I know there's certain lights that can give off a humming noise. All of these can just be what that last thing that is too much for them. You know, this time of year with the sun coming in, and it's definitely something I can struggle with. I love the sun and the sunlight, and my son can find it too overwhelming and want the curtains drawn. There is, again, more reasons for that as well, but and that's underpinning anxiety and sensitivity. However, for today, just really going around your home and maybe where they are at school, of what it is that the noises, or even the other sensories. It could be smells, it could be textures that they can find really difficult. And smells are a really interesting one. Years ago, again, as a holistic practitioner, I changed a lot of what we used in our home. So all of our cleaning products don't have strong smells. And I would notice that certain cafes, restaurants, or places we'd be out, my son could not cope with the toilets because of their strong smells. And he'd find it really, really difficult to go in. So, how do we reframe a demand? Well, before we go on, I just am going to mention this, the Maori word of autism. And what does it mean? I just every time find this so overwhelming. It's so lovely. It means in his or her own time and space. And so, what does that really mean? As parents, we can get caught up, and especially by other parents or teachers, education, or other professionals, of this whole meeting. They ought to be able to do this by the time they've hit this age. And actually, the biggest reframe we can do for ourselves and our children is to let go and remind ourselves they will do it in their time and their space. And I've really seen that with my son, that where lots of children were having either large class parties or big parties, it was never something he wanted or was able to do. 3 years later, he asked to have that type of party. So going at his time and space meant it really worked. So how do we now reframe our demands in the morning? Well, as I've said, I did a recording and recorded what I said. And some of the things that I've now learnt to say are, how can I support you? What can we do together? Rather than putting the onus on them, saying, you've got to get, how can we do this together? How can I help you? Is there anything I can do to help you? And with packing his school bag, even though he's in high school or senior school, and most people may expect, I'll offer to help him do it. Because I'm aware that rather than expecting that maybe at his age he ought to be able to do it, but maybe some days it's just one too many demands. And as I mentioned earlier, the whole plan B, asking him, this is what's going to happen. How would you like to create that morning or that afternoon so he feels he's more in control and able to do that activity? Giving him the choice. And as I mentioned earlier, limited choices. And the biggest thing is being kind to yourself. Because sometimes we've worked so hard to manage so many different things, helping our kids, maybe getting them the support they need in other areas of their lives. And we can be really frazzled. And so it's so important through this journey that you are kind and gentle with yourself. And we all make mistakes. And the biggest thing for me has been changing my beliefs and expectations. And before I come to the end of this, it's just a few of them that I will mention, which has really helped fill my cup and fill my space. And that's been letting go of some of the beliefs that I had, that we must all sit around the table in the evening to eat our meal. Now, ironically, we now do all actually often sit together. But for quite a long time, my son would either eat at the breakfast bar or in a different space, because he just couldn't cope with the sensory of either all of us together and eating, the noise, or just the demand of sitting and being. Picking your battles. Again, that we believe that hierarchy of, as parents, we know best. And I'm really learning. My boys do know. So picking your battles. Sometimes I'll just be like, is this really worth having an argument over? Can I just take a moment and step away? And I'll give you a few tips on things to do by stepping away. And just being mindful. Does it matter? And I've let go of so many of expectations and beliefs that 5 years ago I'd have been, what do you mean? You don't make them go out for big family days out, or they must be in bed by a certain time, or whatever they may be, because at the end of the day, as parents or professionals, we're all different and our beliefs and expectations are different. But I've really, and it's definitely been a journey of discovery. So how can we look after ourselves? Well, in those moments that are really difficult, when perhaps you are unsure of, as I say, letting go of that battle, or there's an explosion, my biggest thing is just walking away and just having a few deep breaths. And I often say to the ladies I support, just close your eyes and put your hands on your heart and take in a deep breath through your nose and out through your mouth. You just really slow down. And everything, I suggest they do it 3 times. Because breathing slowly and really thinking about our breathing allows us to rebalance. It slows the heart down, which will calm the brain down. I recently, in my group, have done a little thing about how to do some face massage and massaging our neck and head to release that tension, or even just letting go in our shoulders. My biggest thing has often been putting some music on and jumping around and dancing to letting go of that stress. Because the less stressed I am, the easier it's been, which is why it's so important we fill our cups up with our well-being. And before I want to end this and talking about changing, our demands and a reframe, I really like this way of describing PDA as a pervasive desire of autonomy. So my son desires the need of his own autonomy. And thinking about the positives, because very often in lots of spaces, people talk about the challenges. And I want to think about all their wonderful positives. My son is an amazing problem solver. He's really creative. He's got an absolute eye for photography. Several of the photos on my website are from him. His determination to finish a project when I would have walked away is amazing. When he was younger, he would follow the instructions to a T to make really complicated Lego pieces. He's funny, he's smart, very talented, and very thoughtful. And sometimes I think it's important that we have their positives to hand, and especially with the school holidays coming up, to remind us. So I just would like to thank Stentalk and Valenza for allowing me to come here and talk to you today. And my whole reason for creating the PDA space was I really saw a need for spreading awareness on pathological demand avoidance, but also sharing well-being for parents. And so I've got various different things on my website, from a free 7-day course that gives you very simple tips that you can weave into your day to look after your well-being. And there's a special offer that I've got, a 7-week course to support you with your well-being, which will support you through the school holidays. And then each year I put on the annual PDA Summit. And if you missed it, you can still purchase the back pocket pass that's got over 28 webinars. So that just leaves me to say thank you, and back to Valenza.
Thank you so much, Nicola. That was, I loved hearing your story, and it was incredibly insightful. Thank you so much. So now we'll open up the floor to questions and answers. So if our viewers have any questions they'd like to ask Nicola.
I don't know what's happening because I can't hear you very well. I hope it didn't...
Oops, okay, well, Nicola will join us again. So I'll just wait. I'll wait till she rejoins. But if you have any questions in the meantime, if you want to put those in the chat, and I will mediate them and give them to Nicola when she joins us again. Okay, here we are. Okay. Hi there. Can you hear me better now? Sound is okay? How is the sound, Nicola? Nicola, is the sound okay? Mm-hmm. Here, let me try to... Okay. Does the sound all right, Nicola?
I'm really sorry because all I can hear is the feedback, and I've just switched everything else off in case it was due to any of the other devices I had here.
You'll have to let me know when it gets clearer. How much can you hear? Can you hear me, my speech now, or is it just the background? Let me see what I can do. Let's see here. Okay. Nicola.
I'm really sorry, I can only get every other word.
Oh, okay. Let me see here. So there's no issues with the mic on my end. Perhaps, can you try with your headphones? Maybe reconfigure that. Could you perhaps use your speakers, or no? Okay, well, we have a thank you from Romaine. Is the sound sounds better? Yeah? Okay. So we don't have any questions from our audience, but I just wanted to kind of ask a few of my own. Is that all right? Can you hear okay? No? Still nothing?
It's just, yeah, every other word is jagged. I'm really sorry.
Oh, okay. So perhaps what we'll do is, if anyone has questions, so I see a few questions come up. just because we're having technical difficulties. What I'll do, Nicola, is perhaps I'll send you these questions, and we can send them as follow-up to our parents and carers. So for everyone, I'm going to take out a note of your questions and send them along. Apologies for this technical difficulty.
And now it's gone fine. So sorry, what were the questions?
Oh, is it okay? Okay, so my thought was that we just take questions and I'd send them to you later, but we have a few questions in the chat now. So from Diane, she says, thank you. And her question is, how do you explain to siblings that their youngest sibling isn't a spoiled brat because we have to do certain things to meet his needs, such as allow him to always open the door?
There's a couple of books that I'd really suggest. One of them is actually this one. And normally the suggestion with Gloria is to use this book to explain PDA to the young person. But actually, going through this book with a sibling could really support them, because it talks about the struggles. And for example, you can ask, have you noticed when you've been somewhere how your sibling has found it difficult? And it also has a really simple way of explaining PDA. There is also a really beautiful book that was written by Ruth Fiddler of Can You Let Me Tell You About PDA. It was a book that I think is in the house somewhere. And it is just such a great, it's a really simple book. And our sibling found it a real help. But I think this is such a great book as well, because you can, in a way, use it as a workbook.
Superb. Thank you, Nicola. So I'll be sure to include that resource in the follow-up.
And I think just also acknowledging with the sibling that it is tough, and unfortunately, because we don't have family nearby, but asking if there's a family member who would like to really take the time to spend time, you know, and creating special moments. So we've worked really hard to ensure that his sibling goes and does special activities, and really giving them that extra mile, which means can be really difficult because you're, you know, having put so much time into both young people.
Wonderfully put. So I hope that was helpful there. So from Lorna, we have, do you have any advice on approaching our GP about our 12-year-old daughter being autistic with a PDA profile? So I'm assuming that's suspecting a diagnosis.
Yeah, I was going to say, because it depends. I mean, every area is different, and this is what's so difficult, isn't it? As you probably know, is that the process is so difficult, because some areas it's GP, some areas it's something else. But yeah, just I suppose if you get the EDQ, the Extreme Demand Questionnaire, which Liz O'Nien's put together, it's on the PDA website, PDA Society's website, sorry, and go in there with the information, be very, I suppose, clear on this is the type of information I'm sure you give to parents, is explaining why you are asking for to be put on the pathway, and whatever the pathway is in your area. So ours has its own neural pathway. Some areas it's CAMS, some areas it's to be asked for a paediatrician. I would probably encourage that the parent asks in a local SEN group what their pathway is, because very often GPs may not know, and I really feel for GPs because they get such a hard time if everybody, you know, well, they don't know this, but they have to know so much about so many different things. So if we go in there and say, this is the pathway, this is where I need to be referred to, can you do it? And this is why. And I think, you know, with a 12-year-old, you have probably a huge amount of resources of why. And it's really difficult, but I would really urge to take away that emotion as well. It's really easy, isn't it, that we go in there and go, well, this is happening, this. But going in with the facts, and this is why we need it. Personally, I would probably not necessarily mention PDA at this point, but just, you know, the demand avoidance is more extreme than necessarily in just found in a young person who's autistic. Does that make sense? Because I think because it's not in the diagnostic manuals, in a way we can give them the reason of not to go forward with it.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Nicola. So if we have any more questions, please post them. Otherwise, I can start with some questions that I have to close out the talk today. So I'll go ahead and ask my question. If anyone else has questions, feel free, and I'll read them out. It kind of touched on what the question that was just asked, Nicola. So when a lot of services are oriented around autism, how can families access that specific PDA support? And I know there's gaps in the system, but what's been most helpful for your journey in terms of this?
I suppose on Facebook and now YouTube, and there are a lot more local groups. So, you know, my go-tos are the PDA website. If you're on Facebook, putting in PDA, I mean, I run several different groups on Facebook. I've got the PDA Parenting Space. Also, the one that there's a link from my website is the PDA Space for the Summit. But finding like-minded parents, because unfortunately the autistic strategies can very often create more upset and challenges. On YouTube, you know, you can follow Harry Thompson, the PDA Society, PDA Dad, who spoke at this year's summit, Tigger Pritchard, the Autism Coffee Shop. He's got so much knowledge. And Academy are primarily talking around adults who are and sharing their experiences, adults who are autistic, but they often are doing talks on PDA as well. So I think it's surrounding yourself with people that have the knowledge, who have the understanding. And I stepped away from some of the localized charities because perhaps they didn't quite understand the differences that we needed. And I suppose it's back to this listening to ourselves and our intuition. And if you're finding that things don't quite fit in and you feel like that square peg in a round hole, that again, being in a position that doesn't necessarily support you. And so looking at spaces which can be difficult because they're all virtual. However, you know, I mean, that's how come the PDA Summit got created, because I was hoping to hold something physically 18 months ago in Cardiff, and well, not even yet 18 months, but you know, with the situation, I was unable to hold it. So, and I know that people have met up. I've met with somebody that I met through a PDA Facebook group. But also being mindful that our children may not actually necessarily gel. Saying that, the talk that I held for Harry Thompson, I and another mum had met up, and our boys they don't see each other very often, but when they do, you know, they really enjoy spending time together. But at short spurts is my big guy, you know, everything in short spurts. And that was one of the other takeaways, really, is if you do a day out, I think as parents we're like, it's taken so long to get out the door, we'll be out for a long time. And actually what's probably most important is to not do things for very long.
Thank you. It's really useful. I have a few more questions, if you're happy to answer them. So throughout your talk, you kind of mentioned how we're often surrounded by demands at home and in school, and these are indirect as well. When we're talking about accessing the right support, so, you know, the reasonable adjustments, what have you found is useful in, like, so how can we help schools accommodate PDA? So I know that's a hard question, but like, how can the parent place themselves when we do have that demand-rich environment? We know school is going to be an upsetting place, perhaps for the PDA child. How can it navigate that? I mean, it's a loaded question, but
the $1 million question.
Yeah.
I suppose it's on quite a lot of different fronts, because obviously it's the emotional aspect, as well as the physical one. So one of the best teachers my son had was really happy that any of his work was around his real favourite interest, which is football. So English, he had to write a story. He wrote it about football. History, he found out about the history of football. And the same actually this year at school, he's been able to do an English assessment, an assessed piece, and he chose to do it on the Wembley Stadium. So it's being child-led, being child-focused, rather than perhaps the focus being, you know, the piece of work has got to be this. So, you know, having that flexibility of mind, letting go of perhaps the fixedness of situations. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then the sensory need, being mindful of the sensory aspect of the classroom. So the noise, that ticking clock, being mindful, asking them, where's a good place to perhaps sit? Preferably a small class size. My son's now in a school where there's less than 18 of them in the classroom, which has made a huge difference. When he was in primary, they put up a timetable. I don't know how much that helped that he knew, but I think high school, senior school, having a set timetable, knowing that a lesson is only going to last for half an hour or an hour, has really helped. Knowing that it's okay, that if it's too much and he's feeling overwhelmed, he can leave. I'm not a great lover of this, you know, having a ticket or whatever to go, but because I think actually that's again drawing attention, being able to just go. I know he used to use the toilet as a go-to. Having teachers being open around connection, and which is difficult at the moment, having flexibility rather than that fixed, this is how it needs to be, this is how we do it. And so, and I'd also really encourage any education establishments or schools or teachers, you know, they can access the summit when it's live. They can watch it for free or purchase the back pocket pass, and we do a school pass. But you know, there is some amazing trainers out there who have come out from being a teacher, know what it's like to be a teacher, how to manage a class, and happy to do different trainings. And again, you know, if people go on the PDA Space.com, they can, there's the list of who spoke at the summit and their links as well. So, you know, we had a whole host of speakers talking around how to support in education.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's extremely useful. So I'll ask my final question here, which I'm curious about, and I've interacted with families that have been asking this question as well. So maybe it won't be a very succinct question, but so we discuss reframing our ideas and creating kind of a low demand environment. So in thinking about sort of independence, developing independence for the child, life is full of sort of discomfort for everyone. We have to experience things that we don't necessarily choose, or we wouldn't necessarily prefer. How can families kind of introduce that discomfort tolerance almost, like without? So it's recognizing we can accommodate sensory needs, we can reframe our ideas, but also making space for life is going to be uncomfortable. There's going to be some things we can't avoid, and how to, and thinking about how that relates to maybe a child or young person being able to live independently and navigate the world that is not accommodating to them, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting one, and I think going back thinking about sort of the Maori, people being able to do things at their time and pace, and definitely I've noticed that when demands are low, perhaps that's a time when I can ask my son to do more, and he'll step up. And I think rather than us feeling we need to do it, they will naturally do it. There are times when he'll happily perhaps help cook a meal or do different activities. So we never now need to ask him to have a bath or shower, because he is quite. We might need to sort of give him a few prompts, but he'll do those things on his own. And I think we don't necessarily need to perhaps push, because if you think about, and I did this in a talk recently about when we're stressed, it was when I did my talk around how normal parenting strategies can be really quite sort of controlling. If I'm coming for an interview and I'm driving and I get lost, and you ask me, you're on the phone and asking me more questions, I haven't got that capability. So why are we expecting that from our young person or child? So looking at when they've got that capacity. And it may not be, which is going back to their age related, it may not be now, it may not be. But I do believe they do definitely catch up. And when I speak with adults who identify with PDA or have a diagnosis themselves, they will say, they will. And unfortunately, life happens, and maybe having some of those conversations, bereavement or difficult situations. And I endeavour never to tell my son, there are times to tell him what to do, but I remember recently there was a situation and a friend had asked him to buy him stuff for a game online, and he said, "Oh, what should I do?" And it's really easy to be able to go, "What do you need to do?" And I just sat there and I said, why is he asking? And he was like, "Oh." And basically giving them the questions back. And so I said to him, "Well, how would you feel if he doesn't give you the money back?" And so giving, in a way, plan B, and giving them that knowledge for them to make the decisions, rather than me saying, "Wow, no," or "Yeah, give them." So in a roundabout way, I think giving them that time, and how my son coped, with his first grandparent who passed away to the one last year, I mean, it were different because of the age of the grandparents, but the way that life happens as well, I think they're able to. Do you feel I've answered your question?
Absolutely, that is so sufficient. Yeah, thank you. I suppose we can leave it there. So I just want to say a big thank you to you, Nicola. It was such an incredible session. I feel like I learned something. I hope everyone watching is able to take something from it. Truly wonderful. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you to those joining us. It was wonderful to get some questions and to hear from you. So we'll be including an impact form in the follow-up. So we'd love to hear from you. What was helpful? What did you learn today? And perhaps how can we build on subjects like this for future talks, whether it's addressing PDA or something similar. So yes, and I'll be including the resources Nicola's mentioned in the follow-up as well. So thank you, everyone joining us, and until next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for anyone who listens at a later time as well.
Yes, thank you. Great.